Good evening, everyone. Tonight we set sail across wine-dark seas through storms and sirens, forgotten islands and ancient gods. We're diving into the entire story of the Odyssey, an epic of longing and survival, of cleverness and curses, and a man who simply wanted to go home. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're lying in bed watching the moon drift by or curling up with a warm drink in the quiet dark, this is your time to rest. This is a story thousands of years old, passed from voice to voice beneath the stars. And tonight it's all yours. The fall of Troy. The city burned for days. Smoke coiled into the morning sky in heavy black columns, rising like omens toward the indifferent heavens. And the scent of charred stone and scorched flesh clung to every breath drawn within 100 leagues of Ilan. It had once been proud, a city of towering walls and gilded towers that gleamed under the Anatolian sun. Its high citadel home to kings who had held off 1,000 Greek ships for 10 long and bitter years. But no stone lasts forever, and no wall, however tall, can keep out deceit when it wears the skin of a gift. The wooden horse had been their ruin, pulled within the gates with songs and cheers. It stood silently in the city's heart, as hollow as the promises that came with it. Inside, 30 of the best warriors the Ons could muster waited like vipers in a basket, swords drawn and breath held until night cloaked the city and the Trojans lay drunken and dreaming. Then the killing began, and when dawn returned, it rose not over Troy, but over its ruins. Among the ashes walked Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, known across the isles, not for the strength of his sword arm, but for the sharpness of his mind. He had not cheered when the horse was pulled through the gates, though it had been his idea, nor did he raise his voice in triumph as the palaces fell one by one, their marble columns groaning like trees in a storm before crashing to earth. There was no joy in what he saw. He moved through the wreckage like a man haunted, his sandal feet crunching over the remnants of a civilization that had stood longer than any man's memory. He saw corpses half buried in rubble, men burned in their armor, women sprawled with their eyes open to the sky, and children curled in corners where even gods might hesitate to tread. Victory had come, yes, but it had come like winter after harvest, stripping everything away and leaving only cold behind. The Trojans were gone, their city broken, and the Greeks had won a war no one would forget. But there was nothing left to fight for. There is something strange about the end of a war. It is not a moment, not a single instant when all swords are sheathed and peace descends like a soft blanket. It is a slow and uneven thing, a quieting of the blood, a fading of the cries, a growing awareness that all the anger and agony that once seemed to matter so deeply have become distant echoes. For Odysseus, the war had been too long. He had left Ithaca with black curls still on his shoulders, with a young son clinging to his wife's leg, and the promise that the gods would see him through. Now he was older, leaner, tempered like iron in the forge of war, and he had seen what lay at the end of glory. The other kings would sail home with their gold and their songs, but Odysseus felt no fire in his chest. He thought only of Penelope, her quiet eyes and patient hands, and of Telemachus, a child he had left behind, who might now be a man. Archaeologists would later dig into the earth of northwestern Turkey and find the bones of Troy buried under centuries of silence. They would find crumbled walls, scorched stone, arrowheads lodged in collapsed gates, and ash layered so deep it told a story as clearly as any bard. They would call it Troy 8 and say it matched the dates of Homer's songs, that there had been a real city and perhaps even a real war. But in this moment there were no historians, only the victors and the dead. And among them a tired king with salt at his temples, and shadows in his heart turned his eyes to the sea. The wind called softly, carrying the smell of blood and fire away from the shore. It was time to go. Odysseus gathered his men, what was left of them. Ships rocked gently in the shallows, their black sails limp, their timbers groaning like tired beasts. There were no cheers as they boarded, no songs, just the silent rhythm of feet on planks and the groaning of oars as they set out once more into the open sea. Behind them Troy smoldered. Ahead, the vast and unknowable sea stretched like a dark promise. No one knew the journey that lay ahead, least of all Odysseus, and the gods, watching from their thrones atop Olympus, began to whisper, "The journey begins." The sea was calm when they left Troy. It stretched out before them in a mirror of silver and ash, still smeared with the smoke of the smoldering city behind. The ships rowed slowly at first, oars dipping into the tide with a soft rhythm that seemed almost reverent. There was no laughter on the decks, no jubilant songs. The Greeks had expected triumph to taste sweet, but the ashes of Ilion clung to their tongues. For 10 years they had fought, and now with Troy finally fallen, they sailed not as victors returning home, but as men hollowed by time and sacrifice. The war had taken from them more than comrades and youth. It had taken their certainty. What lay before them now was not peace, but the unknown. For no man can spend a decade at war and return unchanged. Odysseus stood at the prow of his black ship, one hand on the rail, the other wrapped in the folds of his dark cloak. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, though there was nothing to see but the faint shimmer where sky met water. His thoughts drifted toward Ithaca, the craggy island of his birth with its olive trees and goat-strewn hills, the smell of thyme and salt in the wind, and the white stones of the palace where Penelope waited, if she still waited. In his mind, he could see her on the terrace, weaving by lamplight, her fingers deft and tireless, though perhaps now streaked with age. Tmicus, the boy he had left swaddled in linen, would be nearly a man by now. Would he know his father, or had time erased him like a chalk mark on stone? The men rode on, their arms moving with the muscle memory of soldiers long accustomed to hardship. The creak of the oars and the soft lap of water were the only sounds. Some stared blankly into the sea. Others whispered prayers to the gods or kissed small tokens around their necks. Charms from wives, from mothers, from children left behind. Each one dreamed of home, but none knew the path. The Aegean was a fickle place, and the gods more so. Some had already begun to quarrel among themselves, dividing the spoils of favor and punishment. What had been a united effort under the banner of war was now dissolving into suspicion and pride. Agamemnon would return to Ma with his great haul of treasure and a cursed woman at his side. Minos would wander longer than he expected, though his brother had promised him swift return. But it was Odysseus who drew the gaze of Poseidon, though he did not yet know it. The sea god watched him from beneath the waves, brooding like a storm not yet risen. Odysseus, the clever one, the builder of traps, the speaker of lies, had played a role in the fall of Troy that no god could ignore. Some admired his cunning, some despised it, but Poseidon remembered. For a time, the god held his hand, letting the ships glide over gentle swells under favorable winds. But that peace was only a pause. The sea is never still for long. Even the weather seemed hesitant, as if the world itself waited to see what course the returning Greeks would take. Stars appeared above them at night, wheeling slowly in familiar constellations, but their patterns felt changed just slightly, as though the heavens had shifted while men slaughtered one another on Trojan shores. The winds came soft and slow, warm as breath, yet behind them always lay the threat of something colder, something darker. Odysseus spoke little during those early days. He gave commands with quiet clarity, but his thoughts were far away. He knew better than most that their voyage would not be simple. Too many eyes had watched Troy burn. Too many gods had taken sides. The road home, if it could be called a road, would be carved not by oars or sails alone, but by fate and will and sorrow. The men trusted him, though some whispered that the gods had marked him. They were not wrong, the Sicanies and the lotus eaters. And so they sailed on past the capes and islands that framed the coast of Anatolia, slipping into deeper water, where the horizon widened and the currents grew less familiar. Every morning brought a new sky and a new risk. There were no maps for what lay ahead, only stories. Old tales of islands that moved, of winds that could tear ships apart in seconds, of sirens who sang sailors to their doom. The men had laughed at those stories once. They did not laugh now. The sea grew restless after Troy, as though it too had wearied of war. Winds shifted without warning, and the tide began to turn against them. The sails swelled one day and fell slack the next, and the men grew silent, uneasy. When the black ships reached the coast of Thrace, they were tired, hungry, and already losing the discipline they had clung to during the long campaign. They came upon the city of Isismarus, a stronghold of the Psyche, nestled on the edge of fertile land between hills and sea. The slopes around it were green and rolling, the wine-colored waters lapping gently against a pebble beach. It seemed a place too peaceful for warriors to touch, but peace was a word the Greeks had long forgotten. They had spent a decade taking what they needed by fire and blade. Why should now be any different? Odysseus did not command them to land, but he did not stop them either. And so they did what they had done in so many other cities. They came ashore at dawn, swords drawn and torches in hand. The Ceces were taken by surprise, the morning still clinging to mist and their guards still half in sleep. The Greeks fell upon them like wolves. They slaughtered the men who stood in defense, chased the women through the narrow streets, broke open storehouses, and stripped temples of their treasures. They feasted on stolen meat, drank stolen wine, and cheered as they dragged golden slaves down to the shore. It was not the first time these men had taken a city. It would not be the last. And yet, there was something different in the air at Ismarus. Something heavy, something watching. Odysseus urged them to take what they needed and leave before the gods turned their eyes upon them again. He had seen what pride and delay could bring. He had watched it burn Troy to the ground. But the men did not listen. Drunk on victory and wine, they wanted one more night to revel. They had lost too many comrades. They had won too few spoils. They laughed at caution and wrapped their arms around captive women. They lit fires and sang songs into the dusk, believing that the sea would wait for them, that the land would stay still beneath their feet. It did not. At first light, the Saquons returned, not scattered and broken, but organized, armed, and reinforced by tribes from inland. The hills spilled over with warriors. Bronze flashed in the rising sun. The battle was sudden and merciless. The Greeks, still heavy with wine and sleep, scrambled to form ranks on the beach. Arrows rained down from the ridges. Spears cut through the surf. The fight was short, brutal, and without glory. Men who had faced Trojans for a decade now died in the sand at the hands of simple herdsmen and farmers. The tide that had once carried them to glory now threatened to carry them away in disgrace. Odysseus fought like a man possessed. He rallied the survivors, pulled his captains into line, and ordered a retreat to the ships. Shields rose, oars dropped, and with blood on their hands and curses in their ears, they rowed away from Ismarus, leaving behind the bodies of their dead. 6 men from each ship had fallen, and their names were never carved in stone or sung by poets. Their graves were the shallows, their epitaphs, the silence that followed. When they were far enough from shore to see the smoke of their fires, mingling with the new flames of the returning Saquon, Odysseus sat on the deck and looked back without expression. There was no victory in his heart, only the cold certainty that they had brought this on themselves, that they had been warned that the gods did not forget. Ismarus was not a punishment. It was a reminder. The war might be over, but the rules of blood and consequence still held. Behind him, the men were quiet again. They tended wounds, whispered prayers, and did not meet each other's eyes. Whatever had burned in them after Troy had dimmed. The world was wide, the sea was deep, and the road to Ithaca was far longer than they had dared imagine. And somewhere in the shifting blue, the gods were beginning to stir. The sea turned strange in the days that followed. The winds blew in odd patterns, not with the fury of storms, but with a dreamlike slowness that carried the ships farther south than any man aboard could chart. The stars shifted overhead, and the current seemed to flow against memory itself. No gulls cried, no dolphins followed in their wake. The men rowed in silence, each stroke of the oars more like a ritual than a task, as if they rowed through time rather than water. The sun burned pale and high, offering neither warmth nor clarity, and the men began to lose track of the hours. Odysseus, ever vigilant, stood at the tiller, frowning into the distance. He felt it in his bones. The change. It was not a storm on the horizon, but something quieter, more dangerous, a soft forgetting. When the land finally appeared, it did so without warning. A low-lying coast, pale as bone, with groves of strange trees growing close to the shore. No towers, No walls, no smoke rising from hearth fires, just a hush, as though the island itself slept and dreamed. Odysseus gave the order to anchor near the shallows. The water was clear and still, and the sand beneath the hull shimmered like polished glass. He chose 3 men to scout, gave them careful instructions, and watched them wade ashore. They vanished into the foliage like leaves caught in windless air. Hours passed. The sun barely moved. When the scouts did not return, Odysseus began to fear that they had met with some hidden danger. He armed himself and took a few of his best men inland, following the trail of crushed grass and broken twigs. The forest was silent but not unfriendly. Strange birds sat on low branches and watched without crying. The trees bore fruit Odysseus had never seen before, round and golden, hanging low on delicate stems. The air smelled of honey and sleep. They found the scouts by a pool of still water, reclining in the shade like men in a dream. Their eyes were half-lidded, their limbs slack, their faces lit by the kind of gentle bliss that only comes to the dying or the mad. They smiled when they saw Odysseus, but made no effort to rise. One of them offered a handful of soft yellow fruit. His voice was slow and peaceful, as if each word was a warm stone dropped in a quiet stream. He told Odysseus of the people who lived nearby, the lotus eaters, and how they had welcomed the strangers like kin, offering them food and comfort and a place among their own. The fruit, he said, was their gift, the heart of their way of life. It was not food but forgetting. One bite and sorrow became distant. One bite and the war was gone. And the long road to Ithaca meant nothing at all. Odysseus looked into their eyes and saw the truth of it. They had eaten the fruit and it had stripped from them every tie to home and memory. They would not fight. They would not flee. They would not even ask to stay. They simply were. He felt a chill crawl beneath his armor. It was not a poison in the usual sense. It did not kill the body, but it killed the will, and that was worse. Without another word, Odysseus seized the first man by the tunic and dragged him from the grass. The others began to protest, but he shouted them down with the voice of a king and a father. His men obeyed him. They bound the dreamers with rope and carried them back to the beach. Though the scouts wept and begged to stay, calling the fruit by names that sounded like lullabies. The sailors, waiting at the ships, stared in confusion as their comrades were thrown aboard like cargo. Only when Odysseus gave the order to raise the sails did they see the look in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, and they obeyed without question. The wind returned just as the anchors were drawn, as if the sea itself had waited for them to choose. As the island faded behind them, Odysseus stood at the stern. Watching the shoreline vanish into mist, he said nothing. The bound men wept for what they had lost, not understanding that it had never been theirs to keep. It was not evil that dwelled on that island, but something softer, a kindness too deep, a peace without roots. The lotus eaters had no need for war or glory or longing, but neither did they remember their own names. That night, as the sea rolled beneath the hull and the stars blinked above like the eyes of old gods, Odysseus kept watch. He did not sleep. He thought of Penelope and the child he had not seen in 20 years. He thought of the graves of his friends and the shipwrecks still to come. He thought of the fruit and how easy it would be to taste it. One bite and it would all go quiet. The sea, the gods, the pain. But he did not bite. He clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. And he whispered the name of his home until it no longer sounded like a prayer, but like a sword. The Cyclops. They sailed westward after the Lotus Island. The wind sullen and heavy as though the sea itself disapproved of their escape from forgetfulness. The men were subdued, their thoughts turned inward. No one spoke of the golden fruit or the dreams it had offered. They sat on benches, eyes dimmed, shoulders hunched against the sunlight, and rowed as if each stroke might carry them further from something they could no longer name. Odysseus remained watchful, his hands firm on the tiller, his thoughts like a fire burning behind his eyes. He knew their journey had entered a new kind of danger, not just of storms or sword play, but of slow erosion. Each trial left its mark. Each shore offered a different kind of death. When land came into view once more, it rose like a jagged tooth from the sea. The coastline was steep and craggy with cliffs that fell sheer into the surf. No harbors welcomed them. No smoke curled from chimneys. The hills were bare and rough, and behind them loomed a higher ridge covered in scrub and stunted trees. They sailed along the shore until they came upon a small inlet. A half-moon cove guarded by rock and reef with fresh water flowing from a spring, and a meadow thick with grass and wild goats. It seemed a good place to rest, to mend sails and restock provisions. Odysseus gave the order to land. They hauled the ship ashore and gathered wood for fires. The men hunted easily among the hills, slaying goats and feasting well for the first time in many days. Their spirits lifted, but Odysseus's gaze kept drifting inland. From the ridge above he had seen something strange. A large cave set into the cliffside like the mouth of a slumbering beast. And near it, strange pens made of stacked stone and timber. Sheep grazed freely nearby, unafraid of men or fire. There were signs of habitation, but no roads, no cultivated fields, no ships or harbors. It was a land untouched by trade or war, a quiet, isolated place. Odysseus, curious and cautious, chose 12 men and set out inland at dawn. He told the others to guard the ship and wait for his return. He took with him a skin of potent wine, a gift once given by a priest of Apollo in gratitude for mercy shown during the sacking of his town. It was a wine so strong it had to be diluted 20 parts to 1, and even then it could drop a man in his tracks. Odysseus had kept it close all this time, a secret weapon in a world ruled by force and favor. The land grew stranger as they climbed. There were no signs of plow or road. The air was thick with the scent of animals and damp stone. The cave loomed larger with every step, and when they reached it, they found it half shaded by overhanging rock and marked by the soot of ancient fires. Inside were great clay jars of milk and cheese, racks of drying meat, and baskets of sheep dung neatly swept. Everything was huge. The tools were crude but enormous, the shelves chest-high to a grown man. The sheep themselves were larger than any they had seen, thick of wool and placid-eyed. The men grew uneasy, sensing that whatever dwelled here was no common shepherd. But the hunger in their bellies and the thrill of discovery pushed caution aside. They lit a fire, cut slices of cheese, and waited for the owner to return. He came at dusk. The sound of his footfalls alone froze the blood in their veins. Stones shifted beneath him like pebbles. The sheep came in first, docile and bleeding. Then the silhouette of the giant filled the cave mouth. He stood as tall as the roof, broad as 2 oxen yoked together. His face was brutish and uneven, but it was the single eye in the center of his forehead that held them transfixed. One eye wide and black, gleaming with dull intelligence. He moved slowly, deliberately, sealing the cave with a great slab of stone that took all his strength to roll into place. Then he turned to the firelight and saw them. There was no talk of hospitality, no questions, no greetings. The Cyclops, for that was what he was, a child of the old gods and the deep earth, reached down and seized 2 men before the others could rise. He dashed their skulls against the stone and devoured them raw, bone and all, blood running down his chin like wine. The Greeks screamed and scattered into the shadows, but there was nowhere to run. The stone blocked the entrance. They were trapped in the lair of a monster older than memory, and the only thing between them and death was the wit of their captain. Odysseus said nothing that night. He watched the giant sleep, his belly round and slick with gore, snoring like a volcano. Odysseus turned the plan over in his mind, piece by careful piece. There was no fighting this creature. No spear or blade would pierce that hide. He would have to be tricked. At dawn, when the Cyclops stirred and began his morning routine, milking the sheep and making his breakfast of another unfortunate Greek, Odysseus stepped forward. He brought the wine. He bowed low and offered it with both hands, speaking in the tones of a humble wanderer. The Cyclops, curious, drank. He liked the taste and asked for more. Odysseus gave it 3 times. The giant's words began to slur. His breath grew heavy and his eye began to close. Before the giant slumped into his drunken stupor, he asked the name of the clever stranger. Odysseus smiled with cold cunning and replied, "My name is Nobody." The monster laughed and promised to eat nobody last. When the Cyclops had collapsed into wine-sodden sleep, Odysseus gathered his men and showed them the sharpened stake he had carved from a piece of green olive wood. They heated it in the fire until it glowed red. Then, with all their strength, they drove it into the single sleeping eye of the Cyclops. The sound was like a wet tree splitting. The creature screamed, thrashing and howling, tearing the air with his pain. The cave shook. Blood and smoke poured from the ruined socket. He clawed at the air, calling for help from the other Cyclopes who dwelled in the hills nearby. They came calling through the stone, asking what had happened. The blinded giant cried out, "Nobody has hurt me. Nobody is killing me." The others, hearing this, cursed him for his drunkenness and left him to his suffering. Odysseus and his men waited through the night as the Cyclops raged and roared, groping blindly for them. They dared not sleep. At dawn, when the giant rolled aside the stone to let the sheep out to graze, Odysseus tied his men beneath the bellies of the largest rams. He clung beneath the biggest of all, silent as breath. The blinded Cyclops stood in the mouth of the cave, running his hands over the backs of the animals as they passed, feeling for men. He found none. The Greeks slipped past him, clinging to wool, and once they were outside, they cut themselves free and ran to the ship. As they pushed off from the shore, Odysseus stood at the stern and shouted back to the cliffs. He could not help himself. Pride rose in him like a tide, and he cried out his true name. "I am Odysseus of Ithaca. It was I who blinded you, monster. Tell your father it was I. Tell Poseidon." The Cyclops roared, lifting his arms to the sky, and called upon the god of the sea, his father, to curse this man who had stolen his sight. And far below the waves, something ancient stirred. The ship pulled away from the shore as fast as oars could churn water. The men rowed with the desperation of men who had looked death in the eye and found it half blind but still grasping. The cliffs of the Cyclopes island loomed behind them, gray and jagged, lit by the pale light of morning. Smoke still curled from the cave mouth, and the howls of the blinded giant echoed faintly across the waves. The men said nothing. Their hands were bloodied from gripping the ropes that had bound them beneath sheep. Their backs ached. Their legs were raw, but they were alive. And that was enough for a moment. Then Odysseus stood at the stern. The wind was behind them and the sails were beginning to fill, the ship easing into a smoother rhythm, the danger left behind. He turned his eyes to the shore, to the black mouth of the cave that had swallowed and nearly destroyed them, and he raised his voice. He shouted, not a farewell, but a name, his own name, a name that had once carried weight among kings. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Tell your father who blinded you. Tell him who outwitted you. Tell him who made you howl. The men froze, or slipped, eyes turned toward their captain in disbelief. It was as though he had tossed a stone into still water, and they were all watching the ripples spread. For a moment all was quiet. The cliffs stood tall. The waves lapped softly against the hull. The sheep bleated somewhere in the hills. Then the roar came, a voice like the cracking of mountains, thick with agony and rage, rising from the island and striking the sea like a hammer. The Cyclops had heard, and he had called upon his father, Poseidon, Earth-shaker, Lord of the sea, brother of Zeus and Hades, god of salt and storm and vengeance. The sea that had moments before been smooth and quiet began to shiver. The winds twisted. Clouds gathered where there had been none. The very water seemed to breathe, inhaling deeply beneath the hull. The sky turned the color of iron, and every man aboard that ship knew with the cold certainty that settles in the belly like stone that the sea would never be safe again. Poseidon heard his son's curse. He listened to the words spoken by Polyphemus through shattered teeth and bloodied lips. The god did not speak in reply. He did not need to. The answer came in the turning of the tide, in the sudden pitch of the ship, in the pull of forces unseen. It came in the tightening of Odysseus's jaw, in the way his eyes searched the horizon for storms that had not yet formed, but would. He knew what he had done. His pride had struck a deeper wound than the stake driven into the Cyclops' eye. He had declared himself to the gods. And gods do not forget. The wrath of Poseidon. That night they found no safe harbor. The winds drove them south and east, then back west again, as if the sea itself could not decide where to send them. Stars were hidden behind veils of cloud. The moon shone like a knife's edge before vanishing altogether. The men clung to the sides of the ship and whispered prayers to gods who would not answer. Some wept, some cursed, but all of them turned their eyes again and again to Odysseus. It was he who had brought them to Troy, he who had led them out of the Cyclops' cave. And now it was he who had spoken too loudly, who had drawn the wrath of a god who ruled the very waters beneath them. Odysseus did not sleep. He stood at the stern with one hand wrapped around the tiller and the other clutching the cloak around his shoulders. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the cliffs they had escaped. He said nothing, but inside him the fire of shame burned hotter than the pride that had sparked it. He had outwitted a monster, but he had forgotten that monsters have fathers, and fathers, especially divine ones, have long memories and endless reach. As the sun rose behind veils of mist, they saw the sea calm once more, but it was a silence that promised nothing. It was not peace. It was not mercy. It was the breath before a storm. And Odysseus, though still far from home, knew in his bones that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The sea would rise against him again and again, not because he had sinned in ignorance, but because he had spoken his name in triumph. And the gods above all else do not suffer mortals who forget their place. The sea gave them no rest, only brief moments of mercy. The days that followed the curse of Poseidon were grim and restless. The men's eyes sunken and shoulders hunched from sleepless nights. Each morning brought uncertainty. Each evening carried the scent of dread. The wind did not howl, but whispered in strange voices, shifting direction with a cunning malice that could not be charted. The stars above no longer seemed to hold meaning. The constellations twisted, unfamiliar in shape and place, and the moon vanished more than it showed its face. Odysseus stood at the helm through much of it, hands blistered from rope and salt, eyes fixed not on the sea before him, but on something deeper. He was not simply navigating the waves. He was navigating the will of gods, and that was a far crueler current. Aeolus and the Bag of Winds. It was on the 12th day after they fled the island of the Cyclopes that they came upon a place unlike any other they had seen. The island rose from the sea in smooth green swells, and its cliffs were capped with towers that shimmered, not with marble, but with polished bronze that gleamed like fire under the sun. The shoreline was calm, the harbor gentle, and the scent of the air was not salt and decay, but cedar and spice. The men exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for days. Even the sea seemed to ease beneath the ship as they sailed toward it, as if it too bowed to the strange power that lived there. This was the floating Isle of Aeolia, home to the Keeper of the Winds. The halls of Aeolus were carved into a cliffside and polished until the stone shone like pearl. The king himself was no warrior or priest, but a god-appointed warden, a man granted the stewardship of the winds by the will of Zeus himself. His palace thrummed with air that shifted and stirred without source, and the voices of his children echoed in the halls like bird song. Aeolus received Odysseus with the courtesy of an old ally, though they had never met. He had heard of the sack of Troy. Of course, the world had heard of it, and he recognized in Odysseus not just a veteran of that long war, but something else, something older and more cunning. They feasted in the high hall for a full month, eating and drinking beneath painted ceilings while the winds circled outside like wolves, waiting for the gates to open. Aeolus listened to Odysseus recount the tale of the journey thus far. The fall of Troy, the raid on the Cyclone, the cursed fruit of the lotus eaters, the horror of the Cyclops. He said little in reply, but his face darkened as the story unfolded, as though he could hear in the thread of Odysseus's voice the low murmur of divine wrath that had begun to haunt the man's every step. When the tale was finished, Aeolus made a gift. It was not gold or weaponry. It was a thing both more simple and more powerful. He took a great oxhide bag, and into it he sealed all the winds that might oppose Odysseus. He bound it tight with silver cord and told him that so long as he kept the bag shut, no storm would touch them. Only the gentle west wind remained outside the bag to carry them safely home. Ithaca lay just beyond the edge of the world. Now if he sailed well and the gods looked kindly, he could reach it in 10 days. Odysseus took the gift and bowed low, grateful beyond words. They set out the next morning, the sea calm and the sky clear. The ships moved swiftly, the west wind filling the sails like the breath of Athena herself. The men sang again. They laughed. They wept in secret joy. The coastline of unknown lands fell behind them, and the promise of home shone before them like a lantern. Odysseus did not sleep, not at first. He kept the bag close, lashed to the mast with a cord no man could undo without cutting. The men asked what treasure lay within, but he said only that it was a gift for the gods, nothing more. But days passed and sleep stole upon him. When they were near enough to Ithaca to see its pale cliffs through the morning haze, the island a whisper on the horizon, Odysseus allowed himself rest. His eyes closed, and with them the door to caution. The crew had waited. Their curiosity, once quiet, had grown into suspicion. The bag was never opened. Odysseus guarded it like gold. They spoke in hushed voices. Surely it was treasure he meant to keep for himself. Perhaps stolen wealth. Perhaps the spoils of Troy. Perhaps enough to buy 10 kingdoms and live like a god. In the still hours of the night, when Odysseus lay in a dream of Penelope's arms and Telemachus's voice, 2 men crept to the mast and slit the cords with a dagger. The bag opened with a groan, and the winds screamed as they were released. The ship lurched. The sky blackened. The sea rose with a fury it had not shown in weeks. Waves crashed over the deck. The sails snapped and tore. The men screamed as they were thrown from their benches. Odysseus woke to a sky in chaos and a ship tumbling backwards through space and time. Ithaca vanished like a ghost. The winds drove them in circles. Days passed. The horizon stretched. Their hope unraveled. When they finally reached the Isle of Aeolia once more, battered and hungry, Odysseus climbed the hill alone. He carried the empty bag in his arms like a dead child. Aeolus met him at the gate and saw the truth before a word was spoken. He shook his head and stepped back. The gods, he said, have turned against you. I cannot help a man cursed by heaven. Leave this place. Do not return. And so they sailed again into open water, the winds unbound, the gods silent and the memory of home, a flame flickering just beyond reach. Odysseus stood at the bow, hands empty, eyes grim. There would be no more gifts, only trials. And the sea, restless now, would carry them toward another shore where death waited in another form. The Laestrygonians. The sea is a patient beast. It does not need to roar to kill. It can lull you with calm and promise and still bring your ruin before you draw your next breath. After they left Aeolia for the second time, with the wind snarling once again through the rigging, and the gods turned cold in their silence, Odysseus and his men found themselves adrift, not in storm but in stillness. The sky hung low and gray. The waves moved with a quiet that was neither peace nor favor, only absence. It was the quiet of the moment before a blade is drawn. Days passed. The food stores grew light. The water went stale. The men no longer asked questions or whispered about the gods. Their prayers had become private things muttered to the wood beneath their feet or the sky above their heads. Words not meant to be heard aloud. Then came land, a coastline that curled like a claw into the sea, steep and shadowed by cliffs that seemed to scrape the belly of the clouds. The harbor was narrow and deep, the water inside dark and strangely calm, as if the sea had stopped breathing. There were no fishing boats, no smoke from chimneys, no sign of pasture or road. but there was a scent on the air, faint and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Still the men were tired, and the place seemed a refuge after so many long days of drift. Odysseus gave the order to lower the sails. The ships glided into the harbor one by one, their hulls rocking gently on the dark tide. All but one. Odysseus, cautious where others grew eager, held his own ship back. He had seen too much, lost too much to trust still water and steep hills. He chose a handful of men and sent them ashore. They climbed the narrow path that led up the cliff, the rocks slick beneath their sandals, their weapons drawn not in challenge, but in weariness. At the summit they found what passed for a city, though it was no palace of stone and bronze. The houses were crude, carved into the hillsides or raised from piled boulders. The air was thick with a stench of blood and smoke. And then they saw her, a girl at a well, tall and pale, with a pitcher in her hands and a gaze that did not seem to notice them until she turned and ran. She vanished between the houses, and the men, puzzled, followed. They should not have, for what came next was not welcome, but ambush. The girl had fetched not her father, but her king, and the king was not a man, as men are known, but a giant, broad as a war-horse and twice as tall. His skin was the color of granite, and his eyes burned with a hunger that knew neither mercy nor hesitation. He stepped from behind the stones and seized one of the sailors before the others could cry out. The man screamed only once before the giant broke his spine across a knee and hurled his body against the wall. Blood painted the rocks. The others turned to run, but it was already too late. For these were not men who merely ruled by strength. They were the Laestrygonians, an ancient tribe of cannibals, older than cities, older perhaps than gods, and their hunger was not for land or gold, but for flesh. The narrow harbor below had become a trap. As the scouts fled back down the cliff, shouting warnings, the giants came. They poured from their stone houses like bears from a cave, hurling rocks the size of oxen onto the ships below. The cliffs gave them the high ground, and from it they rained death. One by one the ships were smashed against the harbor walls. Sailors dove into the sea, only to be speared from the shore, or seized from the waves and torn apart with hands like claws. The water turned red. The screams echoed like the howling of dogs in a storm. Only Odysseus, whose ship had stayed outside the cove, escaped the slaughter. He had seen the first boulder strike, had heard the sound of bones breaking against timber, and he had given the command to row hard and fast before the second ship had even begun to burn. His oarsmen did not question. They pulled with all the strength their fear could give them. and the black ship turned and fled, cutting through the water like a knife. Behind them the harbor filled with fire and blood, and above it all the giants roared in triumph, their mouths wet with the remnants of men. When at last the sea hid the cursed shore from view, Odysseus looked out over what remained. One ship, one crew, 11 vessels lost. Hundreds of men, friends, kinsmen, warriors who had survived 10 years of war now devoured in a single morning. The deck was silent, but for the soft weeping of those too tired to scream. No one spoke of revenge. No one asked for justice. They had seen monsters before. They had escaped gods and curses and storms. But this was different. This was not myth or punishment. This was hunger, raw and real, and it had stripped them of everything but the will to survive. Odysseus stood alone at the prow that night. He did not speak. He did not weep. He listened to the sea and the wind, and he watched the stars return one by one. He counted the dead by the weight in his chest. And when the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, he turned his face away from it. The gods had taken much, but they had left him one thing still, his journey, and he would see it through. The sea did not speak, but it watched. Circe's island. After the massacre at Tepelos, after the screams had faded, and the cliffs of the Laestrygonians vanished behind them, like a nightmare swallowed by fog, the survivors sailed on in silence. Only one ship remained now. One hull held the remnants of an army that had crossed half the world and survived the fire of Troy. The men moved like ghosts across the deck, their skin tight against bone, their eyes sunk in hollow sockets. The wind moaned in the rigging, and the timbers creaked beneath their feet, and the sound was more alive than they were. Even Odysseus, who had weathered every horror with iron will, now stood alone at the prow like a statue carved from old grief. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He watched the horizon with the quiet of a man who expects nothing and fears everything. It was the sea that chose their course, not any hand upon the rudder. Days passed in a haze of hunger and dread until at last they saw land rising out of the mists like something half remembered from a tale told in childhood. The island of Aya lay before them low and green, ringed with forests of oak and cedar and crowned with smoky hills. The shoreline was gentle, the harbor wide and still. Birds wheeled overhead, and the air was rich with the scent of life. It looked like no place of danger. But after Telpos, the men no longer trusted their eyes. They beached the ship and stepped onto the sand with the caution of soldiers entering a battlefield. No drums beat, no spears were raised, but danger, they had learned, often wore a beautiful face. They camped on the shore, built fires with driftwood, and hunted for food among the hills. They found deer and boar in abundance, and soon the fires were crackling with roasting meat. The men began to speak again, their voices hoarse with the effort, and laughter came haltingly like a bird learning to fly again after a long winter. Still Odysseus held back. He did not trust ease. He watched the smoke curl into the sky and thought of the gods, of Poseidon's wrath, and the long road still ahead. The island was too quiet, too clean. It had not been touched by war or ruin, and that in itself was strange. On the third day, Odysseus sent out a scouting party. He chose 20 men and placed their command in the hands of Euryalus, his most cautious lieutenant. They followed a winding path into the hills, past streams that whispered over stone and trees that swayed without wind. The birds did not flee from them. The animals did not startle. It was as though the island did not fear men, and perhaps it did not need to, for in the clearing at the top of a hill stood a house unlike any they had seen before, built of polished stone and roofed with copper. It gleamed in the sunlight like a jewel left upon velvet. From within came the sound of singing, a woman's voice, low and sweet, weaving strange words into the air. The men hesitated. Eurylochus urged caution, but others, hungrier and bolder, stepped forward. They knocked, the door opened, and there stood Circe. She was beautiful, that much the stories would later remember. But beauty alone cannot explain what held them in place. It was the calm in her eyes, the stillness of her face, the way she looked at them as if she had already seen their entire lives laid bare like scrolls unrolled at her feet. She smiled and beckoned them inside. Her hall was warm and filled with light. There was food on the tables and wine that glowed red as garnet in golden cups. The men entered one by one. Only Eurylochus stayed behind. He watched the door close and heard their laughter rise within. He waited, and when they did not return, he fled. He came back to the ship, pale and shaking. His words tumbled over each other, but the truth was plain enough. The men had vanished. The woman was no woman at all. Or if she was something older and crueler besides. Odysseus did not hesitate. He girded his sword, slung his shield across his back, and started toward the house on the hill. He walked alone, the wind lifting his cloak behind him like wings, and the earth seemed to watch him pass. On the path, he was met by a stranger, young, bright-eyed, and cloaked in the shape of a mortal man. But Odysseus knew better. Hermes, the messenger of Olympus, stood before him. The god spoke quickly, offering both warning and aid. The woman was Circe, daughter of Helios, sister of witches, a weaver of dark spells. She had turned his men into animals, pigs that wandered her pens and ate from her hand. But there was hope. Hermes drew from his robes a single stalk of a black-stemmed flower, its petals pale as snow. Moly, he called it, a gift against her magic. Take it, he said, and you will not fall to her charm. Odysseus thanked him and walked on. When he reached her door, he knocked once and entered. The hall was just as Eurylochus had said, warm and glowing, heavy with perfume and the scent of meat. Circe sat at the head of the table, her eyes curious, her smile unreadable. She offered him a drink and he took it. Her hands stirred it with a silver wand. Her lips whispered words no man should hear. Then she gave it to him. He drank, and nothing happened. She stepped forward to strike him with her wand, but Odysseus drew his sword. The blade sang through the air and stopped at her throat. Circe froze for a moment. All time stopped with her. Then she laughed, not with mockery, but with something like relief. You are not like the others, she said. And Odysseus, breathing hard, lowered his sword. She swore no harm would come to him. She kissed his hand and offered peace. The spell was broken. The men were restored. But nothing from that moment on would be as it was. Circe kept her word. The men who had been pigs once more walked on two legs. They stumbled from her pens, dazed and blinking, their minds slowly returning as though pulled from deep water. They had not known they were beasts. Their thoughts had been fog and instinct, but now the fog had lifted, and the shame came with it. They remembered the laughter in her hall, the sweet taste of wine, the warmth of her gaze. They remembered trust. That was the cruelest part. Circe stood before them and asked for forgiveness. And though her eyes were clear and her words soft, none could say whether the sorrow in her voice was true or merely well practiced. Still Odysseus did not strike her. He sheathed his sword and accepted her welcome. Perhaps he had seen too much cruelty to recognize it when it wore a kindly face. Or perhaps he knew that sometimes even monsters grow weary of being monsters. She led them to her hall and gave them food and beds and songs in the evening light. Her servants moved like shadows, women with silent steps and downcast eyes, and the house itself seemed to breathe around them. The walls were hung with fine tapestries, the floor paved in colored stone, and the air was heavy with the perfume of strange herbs and flowers that bloomed only on that island. The nights were warm and filled with voices, And for the first time in many months, the men laughed without bitterness. They laid down their swords. They washed the blood from their skin and let their wounds heal. And so the days became weeks and the weeks months, and still they did not leave. Circe was more than a sorceress. She was a goddess in her own right, born of a line older than Olympus, touched by fire and star and ocean. Her voice could steal a man's heart or drive it mad. But she was also lonely. In Odysseus, she found not just a warrior, but a mind sharp enough to match her own. They spoke in long hours under torchlight of the stars and the dead, of the gods and the silence between their names. She poured him wine and asked no questions he would not answer. He spoke of Ithaca sometimes, but less often than before. She listened. She smiled. When he touched her, she did not flinch. And he stayed. His men called it a blessing. They ate their fill. They slept in soft beds. They forgot the fear of drowning, the taste of hunger, the cries of their dying friends. The ship lay on the beach gathering moss. The oars were stacked like firewood, the sails folded and dry. Odysseus walked the hills with Circe by his side and watched the seasons begin to shift. They spoke of old songs in ancient cities and the shadows that live beneath the waves. There was no talk of war, no prayers to Poseidon. The curse seemed distant, as if it had been left behind on some other island under a different sky. But the gods do not forget, nor do they forgive without reason. And dreams, however sweet, cannot last forever. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea and the hills turned to bronze, Odysseus stood alone on a cliff and looked westward. Ithaca lay somewhere beyond the horizon, a shape in memory more than a place. He could still see Penelope's face in the firelight. He could still hear Tmicus calling to him, but their voices had grown quieter, faint as wind across stone. He felt the weight of time upon his shoulders and knew he had lingered too long. The gods had given him a moment of peace, and he had turned it into a year. Circe knew it too. That night she said nothing as he paced the halls. She only watched him, and in the morning she met him with a solemn face and told him the way forward. It was not through any sea he had yet crossed, but into the land of the dead. There, she said, he must go to the edge of the world, to the place where the river ocean circles the earth and the shadows of men wander forever. There he must seek Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, whose soul still remembers what the living have forgotten. Only Tiresias can tell him how to reach Ithaca through the curse of Poseidon. Only the dead can speak to one who walks the road between home and ruin. Odysseus did not argue. He nodded. She gave him the rites, the signs, the sacred blood, and the black ram to carry. She told him the words to speak and the names to remember. Her voice did not tremble. But when he turned to leave, her hand lingered on his arm just a moment too long. The next day they prepared the ship. The men worked in silence. The spell was broken. The island that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a memory waiting to fade. Circe stood on the shore and watched them go. She said nothing more, only lifted one hand in farewell. And as the ship slipped away into the darkening sea, her figure grew smaller until it was lost to the horizon. The underworld and beyond. The narrative continues with Odysseus's journey to the underworld, as guided by Circe, to seek the prophecy of Tiresias, which is not detailed in the provided document but is implied as a critical step toward understanding his path home. The story resumes with the trials that follow. The sea was not yet done with them. Circe had warned him next of a strait, narrow and cruel, where no ship passed unscathed. On one side loomed Scylla, the eater of men, a creature of nightmare with 6 long necks and mouths ringed with teeth like spears. On the other side churned Charybdis, a maelstrom of living hunger that drank the sea and spat it back out with a fury that could tear the sky. The channel between them was no wider than a sling's cast. There was no path that did not bleed. One could choose the storm or the fangs, the depths or the teeth. Odysseus chose Scylla. He told the men nothing of what they faced. There was no use in fear when it could do nothing but steal the strength from their hands. He ordered them to row hard and steady. He gripped the tiller himself and turned the ship toward the cliffs where Scylla lurked, hidden among the rocks like a spider watching its web. The water turned black. The wind screamed low and constant, and the sky narrowed until it seemed they were sailing through her throat. Then she struck. There was no warning, no cry, no growl. Only the sudden whip of those terrible necks and the jaws that snapped like thunder. 6 men were gone in the time it takes to draw breath. Lifted from the deck, screaming, flailing, swallowed into the mist above. Their swords clattered uselessly on the boards. Their names vanished into foam. The rest could only row. Teeth clenched, hearts frozen as the ship lurched forward, splinters flying from the hull, the sea roaring in every direction. Charybdis yawned to their left, and the ocean fell away beneath them, revealing a throat of whirling black, but the current pulled them clear just before it could close. The whirlpool collapsed with a sound like the earth cracking. Spray drenched the ship. The men gasped like men reborn. They did not cheer. They did not weep. They kept rowing. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, It was pale and distant. Odysseus counted the oars and saw the empty benches. He remembered each name. He would remember all of them. The sea did not care. The sea had no memory, but he carried their stories like stones, heavier with each mile. And still Ithaca waited, the cattle of Helios. The sea grew gentler after the strait. The sky cleared. The sun rose higher and lingered longer. The waves no longer threatened but swelled and dipped with a rhythm that lulled the men into silence. It was not peace, not truly. It was the silence that follows a scream, the stillness after a wound has been dealt and before the blood has finished spilling. The men said little. They worked in quiet rhythm, their eyes sunburned and hollow, their limbs gaunt. They were fewer now. Each empty bench on the ship stood as a marker of someone lost. There was no need to speak the names. The memory of each scream still rang in the planks beneath their feet. Odysseus did not rest. He kept to the prow, watching the horizon with a gaze that never blinked for long. The knowledge given by Tiresias and Circe still pressed against his chest like a stone hung from his neck. They had warned him of one place above all others, an island sacred to Helios, the god of the sun, where the cattle of heaven grazed in eternal light. Golden beasts untouched by time or mortal hand, tended and watched by divine eyes. The punishment for harming them would be swift and absolute. No plea would be heard. No god would intervene. The sun himself had made it clear. The cattle were sacred. To kill one would be to strike at the sky. But men are weak and hunger is crueler than any sword. As they sailed, a wind rose, a harsh one, wild and steady, that drove them off course. No matter how tightly Odysseus gripped the rudder, the gods were steering now. Not kindly, not blindly, but with intention. They were pushed toward the island they had been told to avoid. They circled it, trying to find a way past, but the storm would not let them go. With each attempt, the sea grew higher, the waves more violent. At last, with their provisions low, and the men muttering in open fear, Odysseus relented. They anchored in the bay, where the water shimmered with unnatural stillness, and the land glowed under a sun that did not set. The cattle grazed in meadows of green and gold, their horns ivory white, their eyes calm. They were perfect, untouched, eternal. Odysseus gathered his crew and made them swear. He told them what the prophet had said. He repeated the words of Circe. He looked each man in the eyes and said that death would follow any hand that touched the cattle. They nodded. They murmured oaths. They swore on their lives and the lives of those they had lost. And for a time they obeyed. But time is an enemy when the belly groans and the sky will not clear. The wind would not lift. Days passed, then weeks. The storm above the island raged without rain, without thunder, only wind and hunger and silence. Their food ran out. They fished and hunted what they could. But the island seemed cursed to deny them. Birds flew high and out of reach. The trees bore fruit too bitter to eat. The very air felt heavy, as if the God who ruled it was watching and waiting for them to break. And at last they did. It happened when Odysseus had wandered inland seeking solitude or perhaps one last word from the gods. In his absence, Eurylochus, ever silver-tongued and sullen, stood before the others and offered his argument. Better to die at sea for disobedience than to starve like animals beneath the open sky. What kind of God would condemn men to suffer for want of meat while plenty stood in the field before them? These were not mortal beasts. They were sacred. Their flesh perhaps would not rot. Their meat perhaps would save them. It was not defiance, he claimed. It was necessity. And so they killed. They chose the finest cattle, the golden ones with broad backs and calm eyes. They built a fire. They offered prayers. They made it a ritual, but it was a lie. A thin veil draped over a crime already known to the heavens. The smell of roasting meat drifted across the island up into the sky where the chariot of the sun paused in its path. The god Helios saw what had been done. He turned his face toward Olympus and demanded justice. If Zeus did not punish them, he said, then he would cast his light into the underworld and leave the world in darkness forever. The gods heard. They nodded. The sentence was passed. Odysseus returned to the scent of cooking flesh and the laughter of men drunk on false hope. He knew at once what they had done. His rage was quiet, his words few. There was no point in shouting at the doomed. The oaths had been broken. The curse had been claimed. All that remained now was to see how it would fall. And it would fall soon. The wrath of Helios. They sailed again under a sky that had forgotten how to be kind. The storm that had clung to the island like a living shroud lifted the moment the ship pulled from shore, as if the winds had only been waiting for the crime to be complete. The sea opened before them, wide and calm, but there was something wrong in its stillness. The clouds moved too slowly. The air was heavy and still, and even the gulls that once circled overhead had vanished. The sun high above burned too brightly. It did not warm. It scorched. There was no joy in the wind, only silence. And in the silence, Odysseus could feel the gods watching. Not all of them, only one. Helios. The sun god's wrath was not loud. It was patient. Divine punishment did not need to shout. It waited until the men had begun to hope again, until they dared to speak of Ithaca once more, dared to imagine the hearth and the hall and the sound of familiar voices greeting them at the shore. They sang soft songs. They laughed. They looked to the horizon and called it beautiful. They believed for a moment that the curse had passed them by, that the gods were as tired as they were. But Odysseus did not join them. He sat alone beneath the mast, hands folded, eyes dark. He knew better. He had seen the pattern of divine cruelty. He had learned that the gods did not forget. They simply waited for the right moment to teach their lessons. And when that moment came, it came with thunder. The sky cracked open like a skull. The clouds, once white and soft, turned black as charcoal and swirled into a storm that seemed to have no center. The waves rose in silence, then crashed all at once, tall as mountains and fast as arrows. The wind screamed, the sea boiled, lightning split the mast in two and set the sail ablaze. The ship bucked like a wounded beast. The oars snapped in their locks. The deck tore itself apart beneath the men's feet. One by one, they were thrown into the water, swallowed by the sea that had always waited to reclaim them. They did not scream long. They did not rise again. Odysseus clung to a spar, the wreckage of his ship torn loose and drifting like bones in a battlefield. All around him, the sea howled, 1,000 waves crashing against one another, voices shrieking without tongues. The storm did not pass quickly. It did not relent. It lingered, dragging him across the surface of the world, spinning him through darkness and foam, and the distant roar of a god who had been disrespected. The heavens raged. The sea answered. There was no salvation, only survival. And even that was cruel. At last, when the ship had been shattered into so many pieces it could no longer be called a ship, when the men had all vanished beneath the surface and their names were swallowed by the deep, the storm relented. The waves softened. The sky opened. The sea returned to its usual calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the violence had been only a passing fit of weather. Only Odysseus remained, alone, clinging to a broken timber, drifting with the tide like driftwood, too stubborn to sink. He floated for days. Time lost meaning. The sun beat down without pity. Salt dried in his eyes and on his lips. His skin blistered. Hunger gnawed at him. Sleep came in shivers and waking dreams. He saw their faces again. Eurylochus, Perimedes, the boys from Ithaca, who had once laughed at his stories by firelight, now nothing more than foam and memory. He spoke their names to the sea, but the sea gave him no answer. It had taken what it was owed, Calypso's island, but the gods had not finished with him. There was still one more island, one more test, one more chapter before the tale could rest. For now, Odysseus drifted alone beneath a sky too bright and a sea too wide. A man not yet dead and not quite alive, carried by the current toward a fate he could no longer see, but could still feel, like the cold breath of something waiting just beyond the edge of sleep. He drifted for 9 days and 9 nights, though the number meant nothing to a man who had lost his ship, his crew, and his sense of time. The sun rose and fell, but he no longer watched it. He clung to the wreckage by instinct, more than will, half blinded by salt and burned by sky. The waves bore him as they would bear any corpse. Cradled by the deep and swayed by winds, he could no longer feel. He passed through rain and heat, silence and storm, seeing only flashes of memory between the long blinks of his dry, cracked eyelids. There was Penelope weaving alone at her loom in the great hall of Ithaca. There was Tmicus walking the shores of their island, calling out for a father whose name had become a question. There were his men smiling in the sun before Troy, whole and proud, and still believing in home. The images faded one by one like breath fogging glass until only the weight of his own breath remained. He did not pray. He had forgotten the words. It was the sea that chose to spare him. Or perhaps it was a god, though none stepped forward to take the credit. On the 10th day, his shattered body washed ashore on the island of Oija, a place untouched by war or time, hidden in the folds of the world where no map could reach. The sand was pale and soft. The trees hung heavy with fruit. Vines spilled down the cliffs in ribbons of green. Birds sang songs that no soldier had ever heard. The air was thick with the scent of flowers blooming out of season. There were no bones here, no screams, no ruins, only the endless hum of a paradise that did not need to remember the names of men. And there she found him, Calypso, a daughter of the gods, born of the sea and twilight, old as rain, but shaped like a girl in bloom. Her hair was the color of dark wine, her voice slower than sleep, her eyes unreadable. She stood over his broken body with neither pity nor scorn, only the stillness of one who has seen too many lost things wash up at her feet. She took him in her arms and carried him to her cave, a hollow of stone draped in ivy and light, filled with warm pools and sweet smoke. She washed the salt from his skin. She wrapped him in linen. She laid him on a bed of moss and let the wind lull him into dreamless rest. For 7 days and 7 nights he did not wake. When he opened his eyes at last, He saw her face and thought he had died. But she only smiled and said, "No, you are not dead, though perhaps you wish you were." In time he regained his strength slowly, like an old tree remembering how to bloom. His muscles stopped trembling. His breath grew steady. He ate the fruit of her trees and drank water from springs so clear he could see the sky reflected in every drop. His skin healed, the pain left his bones, but something deeper did not mend. He would sit at the mouth of her cave each morning and watch the sea as if it still owed him something. Calypso would bring him food and song, but he did not eat much and he did not sing. When she asked what he sought in the waves, he said, "Only Ithaca." And though she did not flinch, her eyes darkened. She offered him more than rest. She offered him a place beside her, a life of ease without war or sorrow, a deathless existence in the arms of an immortal who could keep him young forever. No pain, no aging, no gods, no kings. Just the two of them alone on an island that never changed. She told him he was loved. She told him he had suffered enough. She told him that the world of men had nothing left to give him. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps the gods had no more mercy to offer. Perhaps Penelope was dead or worse, remarried. Perhaps Tmicus had forgotten his name. Perhaps Ithaca no longer waited. But still Odysseus said no. Each morning he sat upon the same rock, staring west. Not because he hoped, not because he believed, but because he could not bear to stop. He had survived too much to surrender. Now, even in paradise, his heart beat for a home that might not exist. Calypso said nothing more. She watched him like one watches a fire burn low, knowing it will go out, but unable to look away. She did not rage. She did not beg. She waited, and somewhere high above, where Olympus pierced the clouds and the gods spoke in murmurs that shook the earth, the name of Odysseus was spoken again. And at last someone listened. The intervention of the gods. Far above the gentle lapping waves of a gyre, beyond the clouds and the winds and the reach of mortal breath, the halls of Olympus shimmered in gold and firelight. There, beneath ceilings that gleamed like hammered bronze and columns carved from the bones of the world, the gods watched the mortal world in silence. Some laughed, some schemed. Most had already forgotten the name of Odysseus. It had been years since Troy burned, years since ships splintered on foreign shores, years since men who once stood proud among heroes had turned to salt and silence beneath the waves. But gods, though they do not age as mortals do, grow bored. And boredom in their realm was dangerous. It meant they looked down again. They remembered their games. They spoke names they had not spoken in an age. And when Odysseus's name rose among them again, it did not go unheard. Athena had not forgotten. The gray-eyed goddess, daughter of wisdom and war, had watched him in silence as he wandered from isle to isle, bleeding and burning and losing piece after piece of the man he once was. She had pleaded often on his behalf, but Zeus, father of gods and holder of storms, had waited. He called it balance. He called it punishment. He claimed to honor Poseidon's rage, for the sea god had not yet forgiven the man who blinded his son and laughed while fleeing the cliffs of the Cyclopes. But now Athena stood once more in the great hall, her spear in hand, her voice low and sharp. She spoke of Ithaca, of a queen waiting in shadows, and a son growing into manhood in the absence of his father. She spoke of a mortal who had been broken and battered and yet had not yielded. She said it was time. Zeus, who had once thrown mountains and set cities alight for less, nodded at last. Perhaps he was moved. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps he simply missed the sound of his own justice. He turned to Hermes, the swift-footed messenger, and gave the order that would ripple down from Olympus and stir the world of men once more. "Go to Ogygia," he said. "Go to the nymph. Tell Calypso that the mortal she holds must be let go. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. The order cannot be refused. The time has come." Hermes obeyed with wings upon his feet and a cloak woven from dawnlight. He flew from the heights of Olympus and crossed the world in the span of a breath. He descended through clouds thick as sheep's wool, through wind and rain and sudden silence until the island of Ogygia appeared below him like a green jewel set in silver. He landed in the grove that circled her cave, where trees bore fruit in every season, and the air never changed. Calypso saw him coming. She was waiting. She met him at the threshold, her face calm, her eyes dark as the deep. She offered him food, as was custom, and wine that tasted of memory. But Hermes did not sit. He did not drink. He unrolled the scroll bound in gold and read aloud the words that had been carved by thunder. She is to let the mortal go. He is to build a raft. She is to help him. She is to say farewell. The cave grew colder as he spoke. The light dimmed. Calypso stood very still. She asked no questions. She shed no tears. But her jaw was clenched and her hands curled at her sides. When Hermes left, she did not watch him go. She turned instead to the sea and stood there for a long time, listening to the waves, as if they might offer a reason for her sorrow. They offered none. The gods had spoken. The game would continue. When she returned to the cave, Odysseus was waiting. He had seen the winged god. He had felt the shift in the air. He asked her nothing. She answered with silence. Then slowly she told him what must be done. She would give him tools. She would give him wood. She would give him a cloak to guard against the sea and a wind to speed his passage. But she would not give him blessing. Not because she did not love him, but because she did. He thanked her and she smiled in a way that made him look away. For days he worked. He cut trees and shaped timbers. He lashed them with ropes and sealed them with pitch. She helped him, never speaking of what came next. The raft took shape, and the sky remained still. On the morning he set sail, she gave him a satchel of bread and a water skin and a cloak of woven moonlight. She kissed him once, not gently, not desperately, only once, and then he was gone. She stood on the shore long after the sea had swallowed the last of the raft's sail. Alone again, immortal still, a prisoner of paradise, left to walk the same soft paths and sleep beneath the same quiet stars, waiting for the next wave to bring another broken soul to her door. The final trials. The raft moved slowly across the open sea. A frail skeleton of timber lashed together by hope and desperation. It creaked with every swell, its ropes groaning like old men in their sleep. But it held, it floated, and for a time the sea was kind. Not generous, not warm, but kind enough to spare him a cruel death. The wind sent by Calypso's whispered breath filled the square of cloth he used for a sail and pushed him forward ever westward toward the memory of home. Odysseus stood with hands blistered by rope and eyes bleached by sunlight. There was no shelter, no shade, only sky and salt and a thirst that no water could truly quench. He ate the bread slowly, drank the water in silence, and slept beneath the stars, waking often with a sword of dread pressed against his ribs. It was not the sea that frightened him. It was what waited beneath it, for Poseidon had returned. The god of the sea had wandered far in the days of Odysseus's drifting. He had been feasting among the Ethiopians, casting storms across distant oceans and ignoring the quiet pleas of Athena and the commands of his brother Zeus. But when he returned and saw the mortal hero, the same cunning Ithacon who had blinded his son Polyphemus, gliding across his waters once more, a rage woke in him that split the sky. He rose from the depths in a chariot of foam, his beard dripping with kelp, his eyes black with the weight of every drowned sailor who had ever begged for mercy. He did not roar. He did not curse. He simply raised his trident and called to the sea. The waves answered, First came a wind that turned against Odysseus like a hound biting its master's hand. Then a squall, sharp and sudden, that tore the sail from the raft and flung it into the sky like a scrap of cloth. The water grew teeth. It rose in walls. It broke over him again and again, dragging the raft down, spinning it like a leaf in a storm. The timbers cracked. The lashings snapped. The raft was no longer a vessel. It was driftwood once again, and he with it. Poseidon watched from afar, unmoved. A god cannot be denied his vengeance. Odysseus clung to what he could. A single beam, slick with brine and blood, kept him from sinking. The sea tried to drag him under, pulling at his legs, filling his mouth with salt and silence. For 2 days and nights he floated, a speck in a world of water, watched by gulls and gods alike. His arms grew numb, his eyes blurred. He sang no prayers. The